Joining me now, former Vice President Dick Cheney. Mr. Vice President, welcome to This Week.
Well, good morning, John.
Now, you have been unflinching in your criticism of this administration's handling of terrorism, counterterrorism. Most recently, talking about the Christmas Day bomber, you said, "It is clear once again that President Obama is trying to pretend that we are not at war." Now, this morning, we have heard from the current Vice President, Joe Biden, directly in response to that.
We're pursuing that war with a vigor like it's never been seen before. We've eliminated 12 of their top 20 people. We have taken out 100 of their associates. We've sent them underground. They are, in fact, not able to do anything remotely like they were in the past. They are on the run. I don't know where Dick Cheney has been.
Your response?
Well, my reference to the notion that the president was trying to avoid treating this as a war was in relation to his initial response when we heard about the Christmas underwear bomber up in Detroit, when he went out and said this was the act of an isolated extremist. No, it wasn't. And we found out over time, obviously, and he eventually changed his assessment, but that in fact this was an individual who'd been trained by al-Qaeda, who'd been part of a larger conspiracy, and it was closer to being an act of war than it was the act of an isolated extremist. It's the mindset that concerns me, John. I think it's very important to go back and keep in mind the distinction between handling these events as criminal acts, which is the way we did before 9/11, and then looking at 9/11 and saying this is not a criminal act, not when you destroy 16 acres of Manhattan, kill 3,000 Americans, blow a big hole in the Pentagon. That's an act of war. What the administration was slow to do was to come to that recognition that we are at war, not dealing with criminal acts. And as I say, my response there dealt specifically with the fact the president called it an isolated extremist. It was not.
Well, I want to get to that notion of treating this as a law enforcement action. But what the administration will say is look at what they have done. 30,000 additional troops to Afghanistan, doubling, tripling, or maybe even more the drone attacks on the tribal areas in Pakistan, on al-Qaeda targets. They say that they are actually dedicating more resources to the fight against al-Qaeda than you were.
Well, I'm a complete supporter of what they're doing in Afghanistan. I think the president made the right decision to send troops into Afghanistan. I thought it took him a while to get there. Having Stan McChrystal now in charge in Afghanistan, I think it's an excellent choice. General McChrystal's one of the most able officers I know. I'm glad they're doing what they're doing in Afghanistan. I'm not a critic of what they're doing in terms of how they're dealing with that situation. But I do see repeatedly examples that there are key members in the administration, like Eric Holder, for example, the Attorney General, who still insist on thinking of terror attacks against the United States as criminal acts as opposed to acts of war, and that's a huge distinction.
Okay, before we get to Eric Holder, a couple more things from the Vice President. He's been out responding preemptively to you. One thing that he said, we heard in the open, that he believes Iraq may ultimately prove to be one of the greatest achievements of the Obama administration.
Well, I guess I shouldn't be surprised by my friend Joe Biden. I'm glad he now believes Iraq is a success. Of course, Biden and Obama and Biden campaigned from one end of the country to the other for 2 years, criticizing our Iraq policy. They opposed the surge that was absolutely crucial to our getting to the point we're at now with respect to Iraq. For them to try to take credit for what's happened in Iraq strikes me as a little strange. I think if they had had their way, if we'd followed the policies they pursued from the outset or advocated from the outset, Saddam Hussein would still be in power in Baghdad today. So if they're going to take credit for it, fair enough for what they've done while they're there, but it ought to go with a healthy dose of thank you, George Bush, up front, and a recognition that some of their early recommendations with respect to prosecuting that war were just dead wrong.
Well, in fact, Vice President Biden says that he believes that the war in Iraq was not worth it. What do you say to that? I mean, given the resources that were drawn away from what you could argue is the Central Front in Afghanistan, Pakistan, is he right about that?
No. I believe very deeply in the proposition that what we did in Iraq was the right thing to do. It was hard to do. It took a long time. There were significant costs involved. but we got rid of one of the worst dictators of the 20th century. We took down his government, a man who produced and used weapons of mass destruction, a man who'd started 2 different wars, a man who had a relationship with terror. We're going to have a democracy in Iraq today. We do today. They're going to have another free election this March. This has been an enormous achievement from the standpoint of peace and stability in the Middle East and ending a threat to the United States. As I say, Joe Biden doesn't believe that. Joe Biden wants to take credit, I'm not sure for what, since he opposed that policy pretty much from the outset.
I think what he wants to take credit for is taking resources out of Iraq. The fact
That's
that
being done in accordance with the timetable that we initiated, that we negotiated with the Iraqis. I mean, that was our policy.
Another thing from the Vice President, he also addressed the possibility of another 9/11 style attack.
The idea of there being a massive attack in the United States like 9/11 is unlikely, in my view. But if you see what's happening, particularly with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, they have decided to move in the direction of much more small bore but devastatingly frightening attacks.
Is he right?
I don't think so, and I would point to a study that was released just within the last week or two up at the Kennedy School at Harvard by a gentleman, Moffat Larson's his name, I believe, who was CIA for 23 years, Director of Intelligence at the Energy Department for a long time, that looks at this whole question of weapons of mass destruction and Al-Qaeda, and comes to the conclusion that there's a very high threat that Al-Qaeda is trying very hard to acquire a weapon of mass destruction, and if they're successful in acquiring it, that they will use it. I think he's right. I think, in fact, the situation with respect to Al-Qaeda to say that, that was a big attack we had on 9/11, but it's not likely again, I just think that's dead wrong. I think the biggest strategic threat the United States faces today is the possibility of another 9/11 with a nuclear weapon or a biological agent of some kind. And I think Al-Qaeda is out there, even as we meet, trying to figure out how to do that.
And do you think that the Obama administration is taking the necessary steps to prevent that?
I think they need to do everything they can to prevent it. And if the mindset is it's not likely, then it's difficult to mobilize the resources and get people to give it the kind of priority that it deserves.
Okay, let's get to, you mentioned Eric Holder, the treatment of the Christmas Day underwear bomber. How do you think that case should have been dealt with?
I think the proper way to deal with it would have been to treat him as an enemy combatant. I think that was the right way to go. The thing I learned from watching that process unfold, though, was that the administration really wasn't equipped to deal with the aftermath of an attempted attack against the United States, in the sense that they didn't know what to do with the guy. There was talk earlier, after they dismantled the system we'd put in place for prisoner interrogation of high-value detainees. They'd gone out supposedly to create the Hague high-value interrogation program, but in reality, it was not up and running at Christmas time when it should have been. They'd started months before that to put that in place. They need a process, a set of institutions that they can fall back on. Now, admittedly, this is hard. We had a hard time dealing with this. You've got the Supreme Court on one side that is going to evaluate everything you do, and you got to be careful with that. The Congress gets involved in it. So I'm not saying it's an easy task, but by this point, when they've made all the decisions they've had, close Guantanamo, end the high-value detainee program and so forth, I think those are all mistakes. Those were the tools we put in place to deal with this kind of situation. They should have had something to put in lieu of those programs, and it would look like they do not have that kind of capability yet.
If you have somebody in custody like Abdul Muttalib, after just trying to blow up an airliner, and you think he has information on another attack, I mean, do you think that those enhanced interrogation techniques should have been used? I mean, do you think that he should have been, for instance, subject to everything, including waterboarding?
Well, I think the professionals need to make that judgment. We've got people we had in our administration, I'm sure they're still there, many of them were career personnel, who are experts in this subject. And they are the ones that you ought to turn somebody like Abdul Muttalib over to. Let them be the judge of whether or not he's prepared to cooperate and how they can best achieve his cooperation.
But you believe they should have had the option of everything up to and including waterboarding?
I think you ought to have all of those capabilities on the table. Now, President Obama has taken them off the table. You know, he announced when he came in last year that they would never use anything other than the U.S. Army manual, which doesn't include those techniques. I think that's a mistake.
Okay, so was it a mistake when your administration took on the Richard Reed case? This is very similar. This was somebody that was trying to blow up an airliner with a shoe bomb. And he was, within 5 minutes of getting taken off that plane, read his Miranda rights 4 times, in fact, in the 48 hours, and tried through the civilian system. Was that a mistake?
Well, first of all, I believe he was not tried. He pled guilty. They never did end up having a trial. Secondly, when this came up, as I recall, it was December of '01, just a couple of months after 9/11. We were not yet operational with the military commissions. We hadn't had all the Supreme Court decisions handed down about what we could and couldn't do with the commissions.
But you still had an option to put him into military custody.
Well, we could have put him into military custody. I don't question that. Point is, in this particular case, all of that was never worked out, primarily because he pled guilty.
Now, I'd like to read you something that the sentencing judge, giving him his life sentence, read to Richard Reed at the time of that sentencing. Here it is. He said to Reed, "You are not an enemy combatant. You are a terrorist. You are not a soldier in any war. To give you that reference, to call you a soldier gives you far too much stature. We do not negotiate with terrorists. We hunt them down one by one and bring them to justice." The judge in that case was a Reagan appointee. Doesn't he make a good point?
Well, I don't think so, in the sense that if you interpret that as taking it to the point where all of these people are going to be treated as though they're guilty of individual criminal acts. I want to come back again to the basic point I tried to make at the outset, John. And up until 9/11, all terrorist attacks were criminal acts. After 9/11, we made the decision that these were acts of war. These were strategic threats to the United States. Once you make that judgment, then you can use a much broader range of tools in terms of going after your adversary. You go after those who provide them safe harbor and sanctuary. You go after those who finance them, those who provide weapons for them, those who train them. And you treat them as unlawful enemy combatants. There's a huge distinction here in terms of the kinds of policies you put in place going forward. And what I'm most concerned about isn't so much arguing about all the stuff in the past about what happened to Abdul Muttalib or Richard Reed. I think the relevant point is, what are the policies going to be going forward? And if you're really serious and you believe this is a war, and if you believe the greatest threat is a 9/11 with nukes or a 9/11 with a biological agent of some kind, then you have to consider it as a war. You have to consider it as something we may have to deal with tomorrow. You don't want the Vice President of the United States running around saying, "Oh, it's not likely to happen."
Now, on that question of trying, dealing with as enemy combatants or through the criminal justice system, I came across this. This is a document that was put out by the Bush Justice Department under Attorney General Ashcroft, covering the years 2001 to 2005. And if you go right to page 1, they actually tout the criminal prosecutions of terror suspects, saying, altogether, the department has brought charges against 375 individuals in terrorism-related investigations and has convicted 195 to date. That was 2005. Again, seems to make the administration's point that they're not doing it all that differently from how you were doing it.
Well, we didn't all agree with that. We had, I can remember, a meeting in the Roosevelt Room in the West Wing of the White House where we had a major shootout over how this was going to be handled between the Justice Department that advocated that approach and many of the rest of us who wanted to treat it as an intelligence matter, as an act of war with military commissions. We never thoroughly or totally resolved those issues. These are tough questions, no doubt about it. You want my opinion, my view of what ought to happen? I think we have to treat it as a war. This is a strategic threat to the United States. I think that's why we were successful for 7.5 years in avoiding a further major attack against the United States. And I do get very nervous and very upset when that's the dominant approach, as it was sometimes in the Bush administration, or certainly would appear to be at times in the Obama administration.
Did you more often win or lose those battles, especially as you got to the second term?
Well, I suppose it depends on which battle you're talking about. I won some, I lost some.
Ending waterboarding, clearly.
I was a big supporter of waterboarding. I was a big supporter of the enhanced interrogation techniques.
And you opposed the administration's actions of doing away with waterboarding?
Yes.